In the years since we put up our Dilophosaurus episode, there have been a number of papers published revising both how we reconstruct the animal and how we think it lived. The biggest of these, which you may have heard of if you're subscribed to Brian Eng's channel, is the 2020 re-examination of all of the material of Dilophosaurus by Marsh and Rowe. They found, most importantly, that a lot of the plaster reconstructions that had been done to the holotype to put it into the museum mount were questionable now. For example, the workers had reconstructed the skull much lighter and more Coelophysis-like than was actually the case. They'd reconstructed the hip, paradoxically, more Allosaurus-like, more heavy than it actually was. Neither of those was necessarily unreasonable at the time. Dilophosaurus has been difficult to pin down phylogenetically. For a time, it was considered a carnosaur, but that was back when carnosaur just meant any large theropod. It's also been considered a ceratosaur or a coelophysid, but I think the only times that it's been considered a coelophysid is when coelophysids were within ceratosaurs anyway. It was also unclear whether all of the specimens of Dilophosaurus we have are even the same species. Like, Wells thought that perhaps this big specimen that was found in 1964 was actually a completely separate genus. So Marsh and Rowe plugged individual specimens into a phylogenetic analysis and were able to say, yes, all of our specimens form one clade, meaning that the genus is valid, and they were able to say that Dilophosaurus is more derived than coelophysoids, but less derived than ceratosaurs, so they're non-averostran neotheropods. It appears that a number of the traits that are differentiating Dilophosaurus from related theropods are adaptations for gigantism and for taking large prey, for macropredation. We've seen this before. In Herrerasaurus, we looked at the first time dinosaurs adapted to being large predators. Interestingly, Dilophosaurus has a slightly different strategy, which is to be expected because, as we know, Herrerasaurids didn't endure past the end of the Triassic, so Dilophosaurus is kind of our first data point for what it looks like when theropods finally break that record. This was an animal with a strong bite. It had previously been thought that the subnarial gap, which is the term for that notch in the upper jaw between the maxilla and the premaxilla, was a ligamentous connection like what we see in Coelophysis. That's not the case. This was a strong, immobile joint, so the upper jaw could actually take some stresses. Incidentally, you might not even see that notch when the mouth was closed, maybe not even with the mouth open. You see, on the premaxilla, the maxilla, and the dentary, there are these rows of nutrient foramina. Toward the back of the mouth, they even are set into these longitudinal grooves. These appear to be osteological correlates for extraoral tissues like lips. So, once again, with the mouth closed, not going to see the teeth poking out, and might not even see the notch. The lower jaw also was stronger. It was deeper and more robust than had previously been appreciated, especially at the back. Also at the back, there were these ridges on the inside that connected powerful jaw-closing muscles up to the top of the skull, which was boxier and more built than we were previously reconstructing it. So plenty of force with which to close those jaws. So much so that it could leave bite marks on the bones of a Ceratosaurus, which is a basal sauropodomorph that it coexisted with. We found a specimen of Ceratosaurus with teeth marks and shed teeth from a Dilophosaurus. This doesn't exclude small prey or fish from its diet. It's just not specifically adapted to taking those kinds of animals the way we previously thought. This was a large animal adapted for eating other large animals. To that end, it had to find a way to grow very large bones in the head and neck without having to trade strength for lightness. The solution was an air sac system. The various struts in the skull and neck are branched throughout, which gives space for the pneumaticization, for the air sac system. That implies an avian style, at least, flow through lung, which in turn implies a high metabolism, a high activity level, and a high growth rate. These were probably animals that reached maximum size rather quickly. There's also these forked caps on the neural spines of the neck vertebrae in the posterior portion of the neck. those imply to me that the ligaments, which were responsible for aiming the head and for just holding up the head, were under significant stresses. Alternatively, those might just be what neural spines look like when they're trying to accommodate the air sac system. I'm not sure. There was a robust trochanter on the front of the femur. That's the process that attaches the abductor muscles, the muscles for pulling the leg forward. They had a long strut interlocking the main ankle bone with the shin bone. I presume that to be a mobility adaptation, but I don't know exactly what it implies. That paper we've mentioned before that looked at the proportions of hind limbs in theropods found that Dilophosaurus actually scores higher than Synapisode or Ceratosaurus, so it's more cursorial than those animals, but not as strong of a runner as the cursorial adapted Coelurosaurs. They were also relying on their forelimbs, their arms in predation. We're going to have more to say about this later, but relying on their arms in addition to their mouth is kind of what differentiates them from Herrerasaurus' strategy. So Herrerasaurus mostly used their mouth for grabbing, whereas the range of motion on Dilophosaurus' forelimbs means that they were primarily for grappling, whereas the opening move when it was going after a prey item was with the mouth. And using your forelimbs in that capacity, there's a distinct advantage if you are in fact larger than your prey and can grab at it from overhead. So that's another thing driving these animals to get bigger and bigger. Even the crests are a gigantism adaptation. In 2016, some workers looked at bony ornaments, so knobs, crests, stuff like that, in theropods in a phylogenetic context. And they found that in lineages that develop bony ornaments, gigantism follows. The lower bound for even acquiring bony ornaments appears to be this little coelophysid that Dilophosaurus coexisted with in the Kayenta Formation, which I'm going to call Syntarsus in quotes for convenience, and that's all I'm saying about that. But once they get those ornaments, those lineages increase in size much, much faster than their unadorned cousins. Both in the evolutionary sense, you know, the descendants are larger than their ancestors, and in the life history sense. These animals grow up quickly. They increase in size quickly. Now, why would that be? Well, for animals living in open habitats that are already somewhat large, having these billboards on your head to advertise your fitness to conspecifics or to potential predators or to potential mates is a distinct advantage. And since one way to guarantee that you're going to have bigger crests than the competition is just to grow bigger overall, which is something you're pressured to do anyway, it cascades. It produces much larger animals much faster. All of this seemingly outweighs the disadvantage that having big crests also makes you more visible to prey. But it's ironic that, given how important crests apparently were to Dilophosaurus, we don't actually have a great picture of what they looked like. The nasolacrimal crests, as they're called, because those are the two bones that make them up, are actually only known in 3 specimens. The holotype preserves a little bit over the eye, as well as this isolated fragment that's not very well preserved, and I can't actually tell where it's supposed to go. The paratype preserves a little bit of the crest where it starts at the premaxilla, and then these 2 isolated fragments of the blade part. The best preservation we have of it, which is still quite incomplete, is from that 1964 large specimen, which at least has the blade springing up from the top of the skull over the anterorbital fenestra. Frustratingly, that specimen is partially beautifully preserved, but then partially, quote, glued together weathered piles of bone debris. The upshot of this is that nice, neat, parabolic, curved crest is a fabrication. We know that there is a plate or blade over the anterorbital fenestra and somewhat over the eye, but we don't know how far back that extends, and we don't know how high it extends. We know that the crest starts at the premaxilla over the nose, but how high is that part? How far out does it extend? We don't really know. And that's just the bones. The 2020 authors think that the crests were almost certainly sheathed in keratin. They compare it to the helmeted guinea fowl. I don't know that I ever thought about this before. If asked, I probably would have said that they were tuberculate scales, like the rest of the unfeathered portions of the animal. But if there was horn or cornified skin covering these crests, then we have no idea what the maximum extent of the crest would be, because keratin can extend in all kinds of crazy shapes based on a bony core. The remains are so fragmentary and poorly preserved, I'm not even sure how much information we can extract from them as far as osteological correlates. So all I can fall back on is that other theropods that have bony cranial ornaments have keratinized structures on those bony ornaments, so it's reasonable to infer that Dilophosaurus had them too, in my opinion. Also, those crests might not even be particularly blade-like. The sinus in front of the eye that's in the anterorbital fenestra actually communicates with the outside of the crests, so maybe there was a resonating chamber there or some kind of inflatable structure. We don't know. It might be just bulbous. Then again, the classic rounded shape is technically possible. We just don't know. A more parabolic shape seems to be favored in art right now, and I noticed that Brian Eng restored it with kind of a flange of keratin sticking out sideways from the top of it. Totally reasonable. I don't know what that's based on, though. Something I should have noticed when we first covered this animal is that the nares, the nostril hole in the skull, is actually pretty far back. But unlike in other animals we've looked at where the nares is far back, the narial fossa, the sort of scooped out area in the skull around that nostril, isn't really present in Dilophosaurus. That would imply that the fleshy nostril is actually pretty far back as well. I'm tempted to try to find some functional reason for that. Like I mentioned that there are foramina in the premaxilla, maybe there are sensory integumentary organs there, but apparently these holes aren't the form of holes that we would expect if that were the case. It could just be that since the crest was already forming a pocket for the nostrils to sit in, it didn't need a narial foramen. So between the incompleteness of the bones, the communication of the pneumatic system with the crests, the nostril being so far back, possibly also communicating with the crests, whatever keratin structures were built up on top of all of this, there's a lot of room for speculation in the exact look of Dilophosaurus's crests. And that's where you should direct your speculation as far as soft tissue structures in Dilophosaurus, not into giving it, for example, venom and an extendable neck frill. I thought it was common knowledge that the venom and frill were only added for the Jurassic Park movie, and that was like the biggest jump that they made. People that made the movie have admitted, yeah, we took a lot of liberties there. But apparently I should have elaborated in the original episode, so that we're going to rectify that. The fundamental idea appears to have been that these structures would not preserve in the skeletons. So once they cloned the animal, it's like, oh, surprise, it had these things, we had no way of knowing. But we do have ways of knowing. Movie Dilophosaurus's frill doesn't work exactly like Chlamydosaurus's frill does, even though it looks like a frilled lizard's frill. It can open and close its mouth whilst keeping the frill extended, which Chlamydosaurus cannot do. It can also rapidly shake the frill, which either makes a rattlesnake noise or the animal has a rattlesnake-like rattle elsewhere, and I'm not even going to get into why that's not a good idea, because rattles are such a specific structure. But the ribs of the movie frill originate all around the animal's head, which is not how it works in Chlamydosaurus. They have 6 cartilaginous or bony ribs coming off of what's called the hyoid apparatus, which is at the bottom of the mouth, top of the throat. So it's the action of opening its mouth and working its throat muscles that extends and retracts the frill. Then the top of the frill, in Chlamydosaurus at least, is supported by these 2 squares of cartilage, called Gray's cartilage for reasons I don't know, which are connected by muscles to the top of the skull, as well as this really long blade-like process on the back of the jaw. So, if Dilophosaurus somehow had a frill like this, we would expect to find the keratobranchial bones, you know, those ribs that support the frill. We would expect to find some kind of blade on the back of the jaw for raising and lowering the frill, and we find neither. More importantly, we should ask ourselves, why would Dilophosaurus need such a structure? The frill in Chlamydosaurus is exceptional even among its close relatives. Its relatives just have throat fans for display. Dilophosaurus already has structures for broadcasting its fitness to potential rivals or potential mates over long distances. It's the crests. It has no reason to evolve a big umbrella-like frill that I just noticed this toy doesn't even have in the right place because it's down at the base of the neck, even though in the movie it's at the back of the head. Now, Chlamydosaurus does also use its frill as a threat display against potential predators, but Dilophosaurus was the apex predator. Maybe you could argue that little ones would need to threat display against potential predators, but evolving a specific expensive structure for just that seems unreasonable. Venom also would show evidence in the bones. Specifically, if it were spitting venom, like the one in the movie does, we would expect to see Cobra-like hollow teeth with that very specific shape of tip for spitting the venom out. You occasionally see a reference to a 1984 paper by Wells, and they claim that he thought that the subnarial gap might have housed a venom gland. I cannot access that paper to check. That doesn't sound like something he would say. I wonder if this is maybe just like everything that was wrong with Dilophosaurus was Wells' fault. Let's just blame him. But the idea that it might need some other mechanism for killing because its bite was so weak, it needed something else to make up for it, might have made Venom hold more water before, but now we know that it did have a very strong bite. And as I implied, spitting venom doesn't make much sense for a megacarnivore. Cobras don't spit venom at their prey, they spit them at potential predators. It's a very expensive substance to synthesize, so it's not a reasonable inference to assume that they would be making it just for when they're little and vulnerable, especially when they have perfectly good claws and teeth. Since we're talking about soft tissues, let's talk about protofeathers. You could make a case for either a fuzzy or a scaly Dilophosaurus. I am currently inclined toward the fuzzy interpretation, but there is no unambiguous evidence to really closely guide us on this. Trying to bracket this runs into disagreements. If pterosaur fuzz is actually homologous with feathers, then that would imply that all ornithoderans are ancestrally fuzzy. If Ornithoscelida is real, then that would suggest that all ornithoscelidans are ancestrally fuzzy, but neither of those are settled issues. Modeling coelophysis, which we talked about last time, suggests that theropods more basal than this animal could have benefited in certain climates from having at least some protofeather covering, but no one's modeled Dilophosaurus using those methods, and they are much, much larger than coelophysis anyway. What then is the ambiguous evidence? So, in 1858, a gentleman by the name of Hitchcock described a resting trace from an animal from the Jurassic of Massachusetts. It's a medium, small-ish theropod. The animal is resting on both its feet, which are about 30 centimeters long, as well as its hip bones. We have impressions of the pubis and the ischium. And in the 90s, an author named Gerlinski noticed that on one side of the pubis imprints, there's these long parallel lines in the rock, these striations. And he thinks that those are actually the impressions of protofeathers. That there was a apterium, a bald spot on the pubis, and then around it there were rows of protofeathers starting up. This claim has proved contentious. At least one author, Kundrat, compared the traces to developing feathers in living birds and corroborated the idea that, yeah, this is a trace that this kind of feather could leave. But other authors have looked at this and said, no, this is just a scaly boot on the pubis being dragged through the mud and creating impressions that look feathery, but it's just a result of the points of the scales leaving drag marks. Though even those authors were quick to point out that just because this particular trace doesn't show evidence of feathers, that doesn't mean that the animal wasn't feathered. Ordinarily, I would say go read the papers and decide for yourself, but what exists online is paywalled anyway, so you might have trouble doing that. I can't even find a decent resolution photo of this specimen to show you. I am inclined towards the hypothesis that these guys had at least some fuzz, but that may change. There were a couple of papers about Dilophosaurus's forelimbs, and perhaps unsurprisingly, Center was a co-author on both of them. The second one, in 2019, was looking at the range of motion of the forelimbs and comparing Dilophosaurus to cadavers of alligators and ostriches. Center and Sullivan determined that Dilophosaurus could grasp something two-handed, it could bring an object to the mouth, it could clutch objects to the chest, it could manually hook objects, it could scratch the chest, belly, or distal half of the other forelimb. It could do a dance involving swinging its arms in a parasagittal arc along its side, and it could seize prey beneath the chest or the base of the neck, but no further forward. As I mentioned earlier, that last one suggests that it was the mouth, not the forelimbs, that made first contact with the prey. And it would suggest that preferentially this animal was going after prey smaller than itself, which, as far as we know, all of the prey animals in its environment were smaller anyway. Saurosaurus definitely is. The shoulder of Dilophosaurus could bend from almost straight back to almost straight down, whereas the elbow could go from nearly straight to slightly acute. Now, that's further than the bones alone would suggest, because it turns out that having soft tissues in the joint, especially in the elbow, extends the range of motion a little bit. This explains why sometimes we find dinosaurs preserved in articulation with their limbs bent or extended more than manipulating the bones alone would suggest. Surprisingly, there was actually some radial-ulnar mobility in Dilophosaurus. That's where you can turn your hand relative to your elbow, but it was passive. So, like, if I take my arm and move it over here, I can move it this far. But if I take my other hand, I can push it further. And the difference between here and here is the passive range of motion. So it seems that Dilophosaurus's ability to do this was like that. It was passive. They could also hyperextend their fingers to nearly a right angle relative to the hand, which after the Herrerasaurus video, a bunch of people said that they can do, and my fingers don't, so I'm sorry for assuming. But the second and third fingers also turn slightly towards the rest of the hand when they're hyperextended like that. Why would they need so much mobility? Well, when you are in the business of grasping at a struggling prey animal, you want to actually have a lot of give in your joints, because otherwise you're going to dislocate fingers or break your arms during every conflict, which is what happened in the holotype. It turns out that the specimen that we used to define Dilophosaurus had quite messed up arms. This was the subject of a 2016 paper, also co-authored by Center. There's a whole array of pathologies on both arms and the left shoulder, and the authors worked out a possible scenario for how this might have happened, even though it's impossible to know for sure. This Dilophosaurus might have sustained a kick or some kind of grab from another animal or even another Dilophosaurus, and this produced puncture wounds in the left arm and hand, which got infected. It either fell down or ran into a vertical surface, like a tree or something, and broke its shoulder, as well as fracturing the left radius. And these two things could have been the same incident, but the left arm was messed up and couldn't be used, or at least couldn't be used without causing the animal substantial pain. So it was relying exclusively on its right arm, which wouldn't have been a problem, but this animal was suffering from osteodysplasia, which in reptiles has a slightly different effect than it does in mammals. In reptiles, it makes it so that the bones will twist around, but the joint still maintains its range of motion, still maintains good fit. Even though it might be at a weird angle, which is exactly what happened. The humerus of the right arm on this Dilophosaurus is twisted around so that it couldn't even tuck its arm against its body, and the third finger on the hand is like zigzagged, and it couldn't actually close against the palm. It seems that relying only on its right arm was putting unusual stresses on it, which resulted in the twisting. And then, the more it twists, the more it deforms, the more unusual the stresses are. It's a very sad story, especially when you consider that Dilophosaurus is a little over half the size of the maximum size that we know Dilophosaurus could grow to, so it probably died young on top of everything else. That scenario doesn't explain everything. There's also 3 tumors on the inside of the right radius, or at least they appear to be tumors, but it's the best we can do with the information we have. We do know that the animal survived these wounds for months or years because of the way the bone was remodeled, so clearly it was able to prevent itself from starving to death. Maybe it was relying on what it could get with its messed up right arm and just its head. As we talked about, the head was much more useful for hunting than we previously appreciated. The authors don't consider the possibility that other Dilophosaurus could have taken care of it, which is the first thing I thought of, but we have no evidence for gregariousness in Dilophosaurus, so maybe that's just wishful thinking on my part. But that's about it for updates to Dilophosaurus, at least for now. Considering the depiction which catapulted this animal into stardom, maybe it's appropriate that clarifying what we know about it just opens up more avenues for speculation, even though it closes off others. But I want to thank you guys for watching Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. We would like to extend a special thank you to these individuals who have gone above and beyond to support this show. We could not have done it without you. Thank you.